All right, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's Sunday night. That means it's time for the Astro Imaging channel. And tonight we've got a real treat for us because one of the people who have helped develop PHD2, and so many of us use PHD2, Bruce Waddington is going to be here tonight, and he's going to take us into the guiding assistant way down inside there, and he's going to show us a few things about it, maybe learn how to master some of its tricks. I played hooky last week. You may or may not know. I was at the Okie Tech Star Party, and I spent all day since then driving home. And so if I'm a little foggy-headed this evening, then several of the people on the crew are going to take over. For all of you who I met out at Okie Techs, it was wonderful seeing you, and I really appreciate that you appreciate the effort that Molly and Eric and Terry and Tim and Tolga and Wanda and Rory and Arno, and you know how big this list is getting, and I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. One of the things that it was noted was that we've made this into a real team effort, and that was really cool. One of the other things I noticed, though, is I actually ran into a couple of people who said that they had never heard of the Astro Imaging channel, and that is your fault. Yes, every single one of you should be contacting every single astro imager you know and tell them to listen, to watch, to sign on to the Astro Imaging channel every Sunday night at 9:30 Eastern, so that never, ever happens again, that I go to a star party and find out that people aren't watching. Anyway, we picked up a few more people. We had a great time, Dark Skies. I'm going to share my screen here because I do have to show you. I'm so excited about all the upcoming stuff that we've got coming up. Remember, there's a couple of things you can go to here. One is TAIC shots. We've got until the end of the month here for you to get your pictures of beautiful nebula, the beauty of dust, into Arno so that Arno can put them together into a movie. And we were just talking that we don't have too many of them yet. And then we realized, oh yeah, we got 3 weeks. And you procrastinators out there are procrastinating and keeping Arno from putting together his show. So get your nebula shots in so that Arno can put that together. And thanks for doing that. We also have good word today that so far we've gotten 4 people who will be presenting on the next week or next month, sometime in November. We're going to have a TAIC workshop, the Astro Imaging Channel workshop. Eric Coles loaned us his data. If you haven't processed this really, really, really nice data, you need to go check. You need to download his files by going to this link here, and you get some real nice dark files taken from a dark sky site. And then you click on to submit the files and you send them in, and we're going to have a discussion about how certain people processed it and what they got out of it and all that other cool stuff. And you have, when do you have? Till October 17th to do that. So just a couple of more weeks to do that. No, actually, that's what, 5 days? I don't know. It's like I've been away. I don't even know what time zone I was in most of that place, most of that last week. Okay. And of course, I always like to come back up here to the calendar where you can see that we've got Bruce tonight. Roger's going to be coming in from Western Australia next week, and he's going to tell us about how to take some nightscapes down there. And we've got lots of good shows coming up for you. But you'll notice that it doesn't go on forever. I did get some people volunteering from Okie Techs to come on in and put on a show for us. So, but we need more. The hardest part of this job is making sure that we've got presentations every Sunday night for you, except, of course, for Christmas and New Year and Halloween, I think. Anyway, that's enough for the upcoming schedule, and I think we're ready to go. Bruce is here. He's eager to tell us about everything that he knows. Well, not everything, please, Bruce, because that might be an awful lot, but certainly the things we really need to know. Bruce, can you go ahead and start sharing your screen and take over for us?
Okay.
Did we lose Bruce's audio?
No,
he's
I don't
just
think
not.
so.
He's just not
He's
talking.
not audioing.
Getting
You're
this
not
stuff.
autoing?
Yeah,
Okay.
now you are. You're fine.
You're good. You're good.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't scare me like that.
No.
Okay.
And you can hit
My
present
name
on that.
is
Yeah, perfect.
we go.
Bruce Waddington.
We're good.
I'm one of the PHD2 developers. I think I've been at this for 7 or 8 years now. And, I've given lots and lots of PHD2 presentations, and probably 99% of the time, I don't get through them all. And in fact, I think the last time Andy did a presentation on TAIC, he wasn't able to finish it either. There's just way too much material to cover, usually in an hour. So at Alex's suggestion, for this topic, I wanted to really narrow it down and talk about something fairly specific and have at least a sporting chance of getting through the whole thing. So what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is the guiding assistant and give you some ideas about how this thing really works, what it's trying to tell you, and where the various recommendations are actually coming from. So to start, I guess it's reasonable to ask why even have a guiding assistant. We call this the GA. That's how I'll refer to it in the presentation. And a lot of it came from the support forums when we first started going with this stuff. And we realized that, over 99% of the problems that came to us over the forum had to do with cockpit errors or equipment errors. And now that's mostly mount errors or both. So, that's an unfortunate situation in some respects because it's frustrating to people. The cockpit errors are generally easy enough to straighten out. You just answer questions and encourage people to read the manual. But when it comes back to difficulties with the mount, people generally don't have the tools to know, what those problems are, or even less, what they can do about them. And so you back away from this and you say, well, how do you really know how well your mount is doing what it's supposed to do? And it's kind of a touchy subject because most people have spent what seems like a lot of money on a mount. Generally speaking, a lot of money, at least in terms of the budget that they have for the hobby. And so they buy this thing and they would really like to have an expectation that it's going to do what it's supposed to do and no longer be an issue. And of course, that's not often the case. So you say, well, what can you do to know whether the thing is performing well? And, you start out by believing the marketing hype, and maybe you've relied on the reputation of the vendor. That's probably how you decided which mount to buy in the first place. And you'll probably get it and put it all together, and you'll slew around with it and look at how well it slews and what the accuracy is for go-tos. You'll probably look at something through an eyepiece, and you certainly don't expect to see the target or the star whizzing out of the field of view. And beyond that, you're just going to kind of look at it and listen to it, make sure that the gears don't sound bad when you're slewing around. And maybe you'll release the clutches and kind of push it around and get a sense of whether things move smoothly or not. And frankly, you're probably going to be admiring the thing because most of us aren't exposed to mechanical devices that have the level of precision that people are talking about with telescope mounts. So this mount is going to look a whole lot more impressive than your toaster or your lawnmower or any of the other things that are a normal part of life. You may, in some cases, decide that you want to, quote, hyper-tune the mount. There are still services around, I guess, that do this. And for the most part, I think you're just kind of getting that done and hoping for the best. But at the end of the day, if those are the only tools you have, you still don't have a really good measure of what the mount is going to be capable of doing when it's put into a situation where you're trying to do imaging. And so what happens is you realize that you really want to measure it, and probably the best measuring tool you have at hand is the guide camera. So that's really what we'll be talking about here. And that is, how do we use the guiding assistant as a measurement tool to understand what's going on? So the reason for wanting to do guiding and using the camera and the camera sensor as a measurement tool is that it's very sensitive to fine scale performance. So when we identify the location of a guide star on the camera sensor, that's typically going to be with an accuracy of, say, 1/10 of a pixel. It might be less than that. It might be, 0.05 pixels, depending on the setup. And again, depending on the image scale, that's going to translate into very, very small angular measurements, well under an arcsecond in most cases. So now you're talking about seeing things at a scale that are much smaller than anything you're going to typically be able to do with the naked eye, or by pushing the mount around or getting some kind of a feel for how the mount moves. And it's interesting at this point to kind of step back and ask ourselves, what do we really expect from this device? And of course, the answer is that we're going to want to assemble all this disparate gear and all these different pieces of software, and we're going to want to line it up and point it at a target. And we want that guide camera to track that target from horizon to horizon and for whatever pointing position in the sky that we want to do our imaging. And the accuracy that we're looking for that sensor to move in a perfect harmony with the target is usually on the order of 5 to 15 microns. Now, most of us don't run up against microns in the real world in normal life, and so it's a little hard to know, what does that really mean? And a quick rule of thumb to calibrate it is that a human hair is normally between 40 and 50 microns thick. So we're talking about accuracy levels that are maybe 1/10 that amount. So this is a lot to demand. And it's no wonder really that people run into issues with the tracking accuracy of the mount, because the demands are so high, whether they realize it or not. So in order to put this thing to work, what we end up doing is using the normal guide camera, guide scope assembly. It doesn't matter whether it's a separate guide scope or an OAG. And we're going to choose a guide star, let PHD2 choose a guide star, and we're going to measure and watch the X and Y movements of that guide star, centroid, on the camera sensor. And of course, what we then have to do is immediately translate that into the corresponding RA and DEC movements. Now that's a translation that is just fundamental to guiding. It has to happen with every guide camera exposure. And it's actually a simple enough calculation. It's just basically sines and cosines. There's nothing to it. And the point there is that that depends on the calibration that you've done in PHD2. So right off the bat, if we want to get very accurate translations from X and Y into RA and DEC, we have to be using a good calibration. One that hasn't triggered a bunch of sanity check alerts, and one in particular that doesn't have large orthogonality error. Well, assuming that those things are all reasonably okay, we can now watch the star bob around on the sensor. And the only difference that in terms of what the guiding assistant is doing is that it's not issuing guide corrections. So instead of watching the star move and then pushing it back into position, we just watch it and we track it and we measure how it behaves for the length of time that we want to run the guiding assistant. So as with any measurement process, and we probably all learned this in physics lab or somewhere along the line, any measurement has uncertainty associated with it. No measurement has zero uncertainty. And we've already touched on one area, which is if you have a poor calibration, then you're going to introduce error and uncertainty because of that. Another contributor that can muddy the water for these measurements is seeing effects. And of course, as soon as you get into imaging, you realize that seeing is just kind of an ugly fact of life. There's really nothing you can do about it unless you're going to find a way to put your telescope out on a satellite. And the seeing effects come from high altitude movements in the atmosphere. And for most amateurs, they also come from seeing conditions right around the telescope. So you have local seeing in the form of convection off of hot surfaces that are around you, maybe convection from rooftops that you're imaging over, as well as turbulence that's set up if you have wind blowing through tall structures or trees around you. Those all produce the same kinds of high frequency guide star movement that we label as seeing. Beyond that, as the guiding assistant runs, it may run into various kinds of inconsistencies in your mechanical setup. And by that, I mean that depending on where the scope is pointing, it may have more or less flexure, meaning that there are parts of that whole assembly that are going to be pulled on by gravity and are going to sag and move by tiny amounts. Again, we're talking about here. The mechanical behavior may depend on imbalance. A lot of mounts require a very precise balance. Others are not so demanding in that regard. Things like wind, you get wind gusts, particularly if you have a long tube or maybe you have a dew shield on it. Those are going to introduce sudden movements of the guide star that don't really have anything to do with the kinds of effects that we're trying to measure. And then there's just, all the other ridiculous stuff that can happen with imaging and guiding. We all have encountered these things. Maybe you're letting the guiding assistant run and it's going to go for maybe 5 or 10 minutes and you're kind of fidgeting. So you get up and you walk around and maybe you brush a cable that happens to go to the guide camera, or maybe you're running off of a wooden deck and you walk around and the deck sags and moves a little bit, things like that. I think my favorite example here was a poor guy who was imaging in his backyard and he was running the guiding assistant. He wanted to run it for a long time. And his wife opened up the back door and let the dog out. And the dog came tearing out there to where he was set up and just ran headlong into one leg of his tripod. And so you can imagine what that did. But the stunner for me was that he didn't stop the guiding assistant run. He just kept going. And then he was a little upset by what kinds of results he got out of that measurement and why the recommendations seemed to be so wacky. So that's what we think of as garbage in, garbage out. You want to do as much as you can to not let this measurement process be disrupted by silly things like that. So let's get to the basics of how you want to run the guiding assistant and what you're going to get out of it. And as probably most of you know, we keep drumming away on this topic. Just like calibration, the guiding assistant is going to produce the most accurate measurements if you're pointing near deck equals 0, near the celestial equator. And by near, I mean, say within 20 degrees, one side or the other of the celestial equator, with the scope pointing well above the horizon. So the question is, why is this? And the reason is that on the celestial equator, the lateral movement of the guide star in right ascension will be the largest. And that's just a consequence of the spherical geometry of the sky. So a given angular error in RA tracking will produce the most visible results near deck equals 0. And so from a measurement point of view, the larger that displacement, the more accurately we're going to be able to measure it. And we want the scope to be pointed well above the horizon just to reduce as much as possible the seeing effects that you get when you're pointing down near the horizon and you're shooting low over, hot surfaces that have a lot of thermal convection. So the seeing is generally going to be best when you're pointing up closer to the zenith. And so those are the two things that we like to see when people run the guiding assistant, as well as when they do a PHD2 calibration. So once you're there and you start the guiding assistant, then as we've said before, we're just going to rumble along and we're going to watch how that guide star moves around. And we're going to be able to log and later evaluate a whole bunch of different kinds of things. So we're going to see basically all the warts associated with the native tracking of the mount in right ascension. So we're going to be able to see the periodic error. We're going to see other kinds of errors that are repetitive, but are maybe not periodic with the worm gear. We're going to see whatever drift might be present in RA. A lot of times that comes again from flexure or sagging with some of the optical elements that are on the scope. And in DEC, we're going to see a different set of things, because for DEC, it's a simpler problem. And this is something that a lot of beginning imagers don't really realize. And that is, when you're just tracking the nighttime sky, the DEC motor doesn't at all on an equatorial telescope. So that means that all of these things that we like to worry about with RA, with gear error and vibration and all this other kind of stuff, doesn't come into play for DEC, because that whole drive system is just idle. So what we're going to see when we look at the errors in the DEC tracking is a certain amount of drift, and that's going to be predominantly because of polar alignment error. And that's going to be the secret for measuring polar alignment. We'll get into that in a bit. The other thing we're going to see in DEC is a whole bunch of high frequency jitter in that guide star position. And that's going to be the best metric that we have for the errors that are being introduced by seeing. And that'll be the tool that we use for making recommendations for things like minimum moves. And again, I'll get into more of that detail in a bit. So all of this stuff gets logged into the normal PHD2 guide logs, and it can be analyzed and viewed by our log viewer tool or whatever analytical tool you'd like to use. And we also, in the case of backlash testing, will retain results for the three most recent guiding assistant runs. And I'll show you how that works. So right up to that level, this is kind of an engineering level measurement system for all the things that are going on with the gear. And when we originally started with what was then not even called the guiding assistant, that was all we were doing. And so we kind of regurgitated all these statistical results, and, it was really propeller head stuff. And we realized, normal people are not going to be able to do anything with this. We need to find a way to aggregate it and boil it down and produce some recommendations that they can actually take action on, and translate these minutiae into things that make sense to someone who's just trying to do some imaging. And that was the goal, and still is the goal, of the guiding assistant today. So when you run the guiding assistant, this is the kind of output that you're going to see. I'm not going to go into any of this particular slide in any detail, and we'll come back to some of these other things. But you go through a measurement process here, and it wants you to let it run for 2 minutes or longer. And the reason for that is that we have to get a solid set of statistics in order to be able to make a lot of these recommendations. And in particular, we want it to run for 2 minutes to be sure that things like the drift rate has stabilized, because we're going to use that drift rate in a lot of different places to make some of the recommendations that we do. If you are just trying to get a quick view on what the seeing is like and get a sense of what the evening is going to look like, 2 minutes is plenty long enough for that. But if you want to get a detailed look at what the RA tracking accuracy is of the mount, maybe it's a new mount, maybe you've serviced it, you're probably going to want to let the guiding assistant run a lot longer, at least one full worm period, maybe two. So you could be running this thing for 8 to 16 to 20 minutes, depending on what the worm period is. So you kind of have to suit that to what you're trying to accomplish when you're running the GA. Now, when you look at the results, typically from a measurement run like this, you're going to be looking at both RA and DEC. And this is typically what you're going to see. On all of my charts, the red indicates right ascension, R for red, R for right ascension. It's the only way I can ever remember it. And then the green is declination. So for right ascension, what we see is, kind of a typical periodic error curve here. This isn't horrible. It's, 10 or so arc seconds peak to peak. That's not terrible. And then in DEC, you see this steady drift rate in the green. And then overlying both of those things is this high frequency jitter that I mentioned before. And that's going to be coming, hopefully, predominantly from seeing. Now, I say hopefully because if you've got some other kind of a mechanical problem that's causing vibration, one possibility being, for example, a fan that's on the guide camera that's causing the thing to vibrate, then that can kind of screw this up. But normally, this high frequency motion that you see in DEC is due to drift and polar alignment error. So when that measurement process is all done, this is the kind of a report that you'll get. And I've kind of outlined some of the key areas to focus on. One is over here to the right. We've tried to boil these measurements down to something you can do, you can take action on. So it's making recommendations about exposure times and min move values. And
Bruce,
in the case where you have chosen...
Bruce, can I ask a question while you're getting in recommendations?
Yeah, sure.
There was a posted question, I think, from one of us. So if you retain 3 runs, are your recommendations based on the last run or the average of the 3?
No, that's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. It's only the last run. So
okay, thanks. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's an excellent question, really. So yes, these are all numbers and results from the just completed run. And we try to put these apply buttons here so that if you are, these are all recommendations, they're suggestions that you may have reasons for not wanting to do them. But if you do, then you just click on the apply button and we handle it for you. So you don't have to go over into the advanced settings dialog and rumble around over there and try to find the appropriate thing to set. We'll do that for you. So in the case where you have chosen to do measure the declination backlash, and we'll be talking quite a bit about that, you'll also have this show backlash graph button, and that allows you to see the graphical results of how the mount performed during the backlash test. And as some of you know, occasionally you'll get a result that said that the test failed, right? And that's very frustrating to people. Even if the test fails, you can use this show graph button to see what happened. And I'll show you some examples of what could happen. It's usually pretty obvious why the test failed. And while we're on that subject, you don't have to run the declination backlash test every time. In fact, there's probably no reason to run it after the first few times. You've learned what your mount is like. You know how much backlash it probably has. And unless you've made mechanical changes or you've made a change in the guides rate for the mount, there's probably no reason to keep running the backlash test. It just takes time. And you can just uncheck this box over here. Okay. So in terms of the reports that are being shown here, there's this thing up here in the upper right, which is kind of a historical curiosity. When we first did the guiding assistant, we were trying to figure out a way to measure, to get a measure of the seeing. And when I say measure the seeing, I don't mean that in the same sense as using a seeing monitor, because we're talking about completely different things. But we wanted to know, you know, how can we assess the impact of seeing on how we're doing guiding? And so we started out with this stuff up in the upper right-hand area, and those of you who have used the product for a lot of years will remember this. And we were using a high-pass filter to produce these numbers, and we still do. But what we found is that these numbers weren't really giving us the insight that we needed. You know, they were interesting, but they weren't always well correlated with what we would see later on in guiding. And I think the problem is it's just too hard to establish the parameters for a high-pass filter that's going to cover all the different configurations and operating environment that people have. So we don't actually use this for much, but we haven't taken it away, because what we've learned is that when we do a release and we have something there, people learn how to use it and they get attached to it, and sometimes they use it in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And so they become very grouchy if we just arbitrarily take it away. So it's still here. You can do with it what you want, but we no longer rely on this thing much for the recommendations of min moves, and I'll explain how that works now. And then on the declination backlash measurement, this is where it'll be reported where this thing is declination backlash. In this case, it was 652 milliseconds, which is, you know, not bad for a commodity mount. And the polar alignment down here was 3.6 arc minutes. And so these are the kinds of things that you're usually going to look at when you're looking at this thing. Those are the things you're going to pay attention to. And then I'll try to give you some insight on where all this stuff comes from.
Bruce,
so
I'm
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but all of a sudden we have a slew of questions that have just popped into the chat. Let me just go through them, and you can at a time.
All right.
Provide some insights into how the recommendations are calculated. Could help us understand when we should and should not tweak them.
I agree completely, and that's what the rest of the presentation is.
Okay, so you can handle that in a little bit. Next question. Yeah. I find that the recommendations for backlash compensation is often higher than what it really needs to be. PhD then spends a few minutes dialing down the BL compensation to get to a good value. It sounds like a question.
Yeah, it is, and I'll talk about that as well.
Okay.
No, these are good questions. I want to make sure we cover them.
If you're going to get to it, we'll just let them hang in the air for
a
little bit.
Yeah.
Next question. I would assume deck balance affects the deck backlash. If you do set up every image session, the balance for each setup may be different, and therefore recommend to run a deck backlash measurement each time you do a setup.
Well, the premise is correct. The balance of the tube in deck can definitely affect the backlash result. I guess what would make more sense to me is to reassemble the scope so that it has the same balance, mark the positions so that you can restore it to its previous value. It's not going to be critically dependent on it as long as you're reasonably close. But yes, if you were doubtful about that, you could rerun the backlash test for that reason.
And the last question, I guess this is a bit of a challenge from Linda. Any idea why PhD recommendation is higher than it needs to be?
Recommendation for what?
I'm not sure. Linda, you want to clarify that on?
I think Linda might be talking about the backlash compensation because that relates to her earlier comment.
Oh,
Okay, yeah. Let me talk about that when I cover the gory details of backlash measurement. And I guess what I would say is for the people that have asked those questions, let me march through the presentation before we run out of time. And
okay.
then if I still haven't answered those questions, make an issue of it, and I will.
There's one more and then a comment. Let me just get to it quickly.
Yep.
Is there any data from the recommendations to help adjust the hysteresis or aggressiveness, or can that be done as a fine adjustment that you would do live?
Okay, that's an interesting question because our feeling is that there's not generally any reason to be trying to fiddle with those parameters. The way that PHD2 is designed is that if the input parameters are correct, meaning the image scale, the focal length, the pixel size, all that, and if the mount is working reasonably well, then the default settings on all those guide algorithms should produce very good results. But let's say that's not true. Then the best way to figure out how you might want to adjust those parameters is not probably with the guiding assistant. It would be with normal guiding and imaging and looking at long time frames, long windows of guiding data with the log viewer tool.
Okay, and Ron, I'm sorry.
Well, and just for what it's worth, just an editorial comment, I've been imaging for more years than I would care to say. I image every clear night now remotely. I've never adjusted any of those parameters for hysteresis or any of those things.
Okay, and Ron said, and I think we all agree, for goodness sake, let the poor guy do his talk and then ask questions. So please continue.
Okay, I'm going to forge ahead, but keep me honest. And if we run out of time, you can always post the questions on our PHD2 Google forum, and I can answer them there. So I'm just going to quickly cover the really easy stuff because these aren't things that are hard to explain, and they're probably fairly obvious. The exposure range, we always make a recommendation of, try to keep your exposures in a range of, 1 to 3 or 4 seconds. We actually use some data from the guiding assistant to know whether you can afford to go with longer versus shorter exposures. What we do there is look at the steepest section of the RA tracking curve, and we use that as a metric for, roughly a metric for how long can you go in RA on that mount without needing to issue a guide correction. And having said all that, I would say that's probably one of the least accurate recommendations we make. It's because we're talking about, one brief sample in time, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty associated with it. And as a general rule, we never recommend guide camera exposures less than a second. Beyond that, you may get a recommendation that you should be getting the camera. You'll see that if the image scale for guiding is less than a half arc second per pixel. We prefer that it be at least that great for reasons of finding good stars. If you are running with a calibration that generated sanity check alerts, we're going to wave our arms about that and suggest that you should redo the calibration. If the star's too dim, we'll tell you that. I doubt many of you do that. We do not infrequently squawk about focus, and that's because we found that a lot of beginners don't do a very good job of focusing the guide camera, and so they're dealing with these big, fuzzy, bloated guide stars, and that really degrades the guiding performance. So about all we can do there is say, well, if the image scale is less than 1 arc second per pixel, then we're probably not horribly undersampling it. And if we see half flux diameter values that are greater than 4.5,
Hey, Bruce.
Yeah.
You're picking up a decent bit. I don't know if somebody in your house is watching a movie or something, but your internet connection is dropping a bit.
Okay. I'm not sure what I can do about that. So I'm cutting in and out. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's not kind of robotic. Is anybody else using some heavy internet in your house at all? Watching a movie, playing a video game?
No, I don't think so. What if I disable? I guess I can't. Should I disable the camera?
Oh, actually, hold on a second. There's something so there's a decent chance it's my connection going out on the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, keep talking and I'll work on it.
Okay. So that's the story on the focus recommendations. And if we measure very low backlash values on the mount, even historically, or you told us at the time you were running the configurator that it has absolute encoders, then we'll recommend that you use low pass 2 for declination. That's kind of self-explanatory. I don't imagine you'll either see that or you won't. It's most people don't. So now let's get into the harder things and the things that people sometimes are skeptical about or don't understand. And one is the polar alignment error that we measured. And as I said, that's being measured from the declination drift. And the thing to keep in mind about this is that there's no reason to obsess about the polar alignment error. And the reason is that all that does is introduce potentially rotation of the star field on the main camera. And as it turns out, the tolerances on that are generally pretty loose. So drift is the easiest thing in the world to handle in guiding. It's very easy to guide out. So there's really no reason from our point of view to try to get microscopically fine accuracy on polar alignment. That matters if you're trying to run unguided, then it's got to be spot on. But from our point of view, normal guiding, there's no reason to spend a lot of time trying to get tiny values for alignment error. As I mentioned before, this should be done close to DEC equals 0 because at DEC equals 0, all of the drift in in DEC is going to be attributable to polar alignment error. And again, the reasons where you might get inaccurate results or inconsistent results is the same things we talked about before: calibration errors, flexure, seeing conditions, things of that nature. One thing that you have to think about is if you have done a polar alignment using one of the polar alignment tools where you're pointing at the North Pole, usually you will have loosened things on the mount and jiggered around and then retightened them. And you have to ask yourself, if you then slew 90 degrees away from that in both DEC and RA, are those things really going to hold tight? Or do you have a circumstance where it's dialed in perfectly pointing at the pole, but when you move the scope around and things start happening and the scope is slewing, are things able to move around such that you introduce error that you had previously taken out? That can happen. Similarly, we've seen situations where people have a tripod set up on a hill or on the mud, and one leg of the tripod is slowly sinking into the ground. Those kinds of things can affect polar alignment error. And here's just the math behind it. Not very interesting. This isn't something that we invented. It's from a published publication. When you run the guiding assistant for long periods of time, we measure the polar alignment error by breaking it up into overlapping 2-minute intervals. And we choose the best of those intervals for estimating your polar alignment error. Generally speaking, excuse me, we think that any alignment error less than about 5 arc minutes is good enough. And if you're trying to guide in only one direction, or you have a huge amount of deck backslash, then you're probably better off with a larger alignment error, maybe up as high as 10 arc minutes. So I'm wondering if I can mute this just for a second and go and get a glass of water, then maybe somebody can fill the air here, and I'll be back in 30 seconds. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Go
Yeah.
for it.
I want to tell you a little bit about while Bruce is getting this glass of water. Some of the comments I got from people while I was visiting at Okie Techs were that we provided a lot of good services for people through the years, and that we seem to have been doing better lately with some of the content. We aren't doing the open sessions anymore, and that seemed to be popular with the few people I was talking to about this. And the team approach. Right now, we've got 3 different people who can stream the software. We've also improved just lately. Tim and Eric have completed a set of software that will allow us to stream our sessions more effectively, we hope. We certainly hope, because we're spending a lot of money on it. And we can thank you, those of you who've hit the donation button through the months and years. And there are some people who have made some fantastically large donations to the Astro Imaging channel. Not like we ever were into this for making money, but we wanted to cover our costs. So we're doing that kind of stuff, and we really appreciate your contributions to that. But again, what we need most out of you is passing the word to your buddies that there is such a resource for them, with almost 400 shows now out there, and Wanda's wonderful spreadsheet that'll lead you to them, and to provide presentations. Yes, there are people like Bruce who are obviously geniuses who have spent years working on this and love to share their stuff. But there are also a lot of us who aren't particularly geniuses, like myself and others, that just have learned some stuff and they can spread the word. And if you want to do a presentation, feel free to come on along and volunteer for that. Okay, Bruce, you
I'm
finished?
back. Yeah, hopefully
Okay.
I'll be able to talk for a little while. This is ridiculous.
Well, this is a real informal thing. I think we mentioned that during the warm up, and
Well, that's a very good thing. Yes.
yeah, it's a very we're all buddies in this, and it's kind of like their club meeting.
Okay.
So later on, you'll look at the comments and you say, "Hey, wait a minute, what are those people talking about the weather for?" Stuff like that. It happens. Anyway,
All right.
Bruce.
I'm back. So let me talk about how we compute these min-move values, because this is something that people are sometimes bothered about. The idea behind min-moves is to avoid issuing guide corrections for errors that are really just caused by seeing. We call that chasing the seeing. It is a real phenomenon. The problem is that seeing fluctuations from the atmosphere cause variation on time scales of hundreds to even thousands of a second. And you are simply not going to guide those out. And so one of the major challenges of this kind of guiding is to be able to distinguish between something that is probably just a seeing effect, which you can't do anything about, or something that is caused by a tracking error of some kind, that would benefit from sending a guide command. And the min move value is the most straightforward way of doing that. You basically set a floor that says, if I see a guide star deflection that's below that value, I'm going to ignore it. I'm not going to try to correct for it. And what we do, as I mentioned before, is we watch the high frequency movement of the star in deck, knowing that the deck motor isn't running. And we watch to see how those behave and use that as a metric for where we should set that seeing floor. So what we actually have to do is measure all those deflections, and then we have to correct for the drift, because there will be drift. And then we just compute standard deviations for those tracking errors. And we want to recommend a deck min move that is likely to produce something between a 10 and 20% activity level for deck guiding, meaning that you would only be seeing deck guide corrections happening every maybe 10 to 20% of the time. If you're seeing guide corrections in deck that are up in, close to 100%, then you are chasing the seeing. And so that's where that deck min move value comes from. And then in the case of RA, we can be a little more liberal about it. The issue in deck is that on almost all geared mounts, if you change direction in declination, you're going to incur some amount of delay, we call it reversal delay or backlash, that is going to affect how well that correction is implemented. And so it's easy to induce oscillations in deck if you are being too aggressive about issuing deck guide corrections. So that's why we're so stingy about it here and looking for a 10 or 20% activity level, not 80 or 90. Now, in the case of RA, backlash is not an issue, because even though we may be wanting to move the guide star east or west on the sensor, we're not ever changing the direction of the RA drive system. It's always churning to the west. All we're changing is the rate at which it's moving. So we don't worry about backlash, and therefore there isn't nearly as much penalty to be paid if we are too aggressive about guiding and we're starting to chase the seeing a little bit. And so what we do is we generally set the RA min move to be about 65% of whatever we've recommended for deck. And that's why the two min move values are not the same. Okay, the difference is that you pay much more of a penalty in deck for setting that floor too low than you do in RA. And in RA, we know that there are all kinds of contributors to tracking error, and mounts generally need to be guided more aggressively in RA than they are in deck. And now we're up to backlash measurement, which is where a lot of those questions were coming from, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with this. We call it backlash measurement because, that's a term people were familiar with. Technically speaking, that isn't really what it is. What we're measuring is a reversal delay, okay? And that's a measure that involves both pure backlash and, if it's present, some amount of stiction, which is static friction or static resistance. So what we can say with some considerable accuracy is that when we switched directions from going north to going south, it took a second before we saw any movement at all in deck. Now that might be a second worth of just pure backlash. And that what we mean by that is that the gears simply aren't meshed until that 1 second of correction has elapsed, at which point the gears are re-engaged going in the opposite direction. That's backlash. Stiction just means that there's something in that axis system that is sticky. It's resisting the ability of the axis to move in the opposite direction. So what we're really measuring with this backlash test is this reversal delay. And the whole point of doing this was not really because we wanted to help out people who were, modifying mounts or anything. It's because we wanted to implement this deck backlash compensation feature, and we needed to have a seed value, an initial value that we would use for that backlash compensation amount. And the thing that I want to emphasize, if nothing else, is that these reversal delays are not fixed values. What you're going to find is that they are usually very dependent on the pointing position. So the deck backlash that you have pointing in one part of the sky is likely to be different than what you see in a different part of the sky. And this is why the fixed backlash compensation that comes in a lot of these mounts doesn't work very well. Maybe, you're looking through an eyepiece and you're fiddling around with this and you're trying to judge when you've made the backlash go away, which is fine, but it's not going to work in all positions of the sky. And if you get that amount too high by even a small amount, you're going to introduce oscillation in the deck guiding and it will never stabilize. I mean, you're just cooked. So that's why we tell people to not use the firmware deck backlash compensation features. Okay, they just don't work well for guiding. So you say, well, why should this be? Why should it matter where the scope is pointing? And there's several reasons. One of the more common ones is simply uneven gear wear. So if you've had the mount for quite a number of years, maybe you're not even the original owner, the wear on the gears is going to depend on where the scope has been operated. So in my case, I do most of my imaging probably between, minus 10 degrees deck and 40 degrees deck. Okay, so probably 85% of the time that the scope is moving around, it's in that band. But that means when I slew up to a higher deck, I'm going to image M81 or M82 or something, I'm now in a part of that deck gear system that isn't nearly as warm. Okay, it's much closer to the way it was when it was originally built. And therefore, the mesh is different. Therefore, the amount of backlash is different. It's also true that none of these gears can be perfectly machined. So to some extent, they're going to be slightly eccentric. They're not perfectly round. So again, depending on where you are in that mesh pattern between the two gears, the amount of gap between the gears is going to be slightly different. And that means the backlash will be slightly different. And as one of the questioners pointed out earlier, it can also depend on the balance. So if the scope is not well balanced on the deck axis, it may be harder to get the mount to move north versus south, or the other way around, depending on how it's imbalanced. And this is one reason why we always advise people to try to get good balance around deck. And if you're, disassembling and reassembling the scope each night, then you really want to get that balance as close as you can get it without having it turn into a big science project when you're trying to get it going. And what this looks like from a PHD2 point of view is it looks like static resistance. We're pushing on this thing. We're trying to overcome this impedance to get the axis moving in the other direction, and it's just not going anywhere. It's like it's stuck for a few milliseconds. And then it lets go and in some cases overreacts. And I'll show you some examples of that. So again, if there is actually a source of resistance on the axis, it might be sticky grease, it might be some kind of crud that's in there. Again, that's going to affect some parts of the gear system in some positions versus others. So major lesson here, the one we learned, the reason we implemented this adaptive backlash compensation feature is because we learned that it cannot be a constant value. And I haven't forgotten about the other questions related to this. I'm going to come back to them. So let me explain how this works. And it, this thing is, I guess, kind of, I don't know, it's a little controversial in some circles, but it's the simplest possible test. What we do is we lock on a guide star and we choose a big guide pulse size, typically 500 milliseconds. That's a half a second. That's a long guide pulse. And we want to aggressively clear whatever backlash is currently on the axis. We don't have any way of knowing how much is going to be there. And we do that by issuing these big pulses, and we want to see 3 consecutive moves with that guide star moving more than 4 pixels, and we don't allow any directional changes, all right? Which sounds like it should be an incredibly easy thing to do, but you would be surprised. It sometimes takes a lot of guide pulses to meet this criterion. Once we're happy that we have really cleared that north backlash, now we keep moving north, and we're going to do it for a long time, either 8 seconds or 1.5 times the amount of the backlash that we just spent time clearing. So we're going to generally run that star a long way north. Okay? That's 8 seconds, at 500 milliseconds per pulse. That's going to move it a long way. And by the time we're done moving there, we can be really confident that the deck gear system is fully engaged in the north direction. Then we turn it around and we don't do any of that backlash clearing. We simply issue the same number of moves to the south. Same number, same guide pulse size. So obviously, if you had a perfect mount with 0 backlash, that would take you right back to the point where we started the north moves. Not the backlash clearing moves, but the north moves. So that would be this 3rd bullet item. That's the starting point for the north test. And with a perfect mount, issuing the same number of moves to the south would take you right back to that starting point. Now what we do then is we correct again for the deck drift, because this takes time to do. It's taken at least 16 seconds. Depending on the polar alignment error, that means that the guide star will have drifted a little bit during that 16 seconds. So we have to factor that out. And then we have to try to decide, when has the mount started moving south in a consistent way, okay? And I'll show you what this means graphically. So here's a case where this is a pretty clean mount, all right? And what we always show you, this is the graph that you see when you push the button that says show the backlash graph, okay? So this stuff over here to the left, those are the north moves after the north backlash has been cleared. So it's chugging along, boom, 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 nice and consistent, nicely, evenly spaced, and you get this slope, and that's the rate at which the axis is turning. Then we take this top point and we start over, okay, we move it over here, and now this white line shows what would happen with a perfect mount. Okay, so obviously you start at this point and you march right back down to the original starting point, same slope, same spacing, same everything. Now in this example, this is a mount with a pretty small amount of backlash. But what you see is there's a flat spot up here, okay? So we issued that first 500 millisecond pulse to the south and nothing happened, okay? Then we issued another 500 millisecond pulse and it started to move, but it isn't moving at the same rate that it is over here. And then we do another 500 millisecond pulse and bang, we're back in business, okay? So if we measure the size of that flat spot up there, that's going to give us an estimate for the backlash or the reversal delay. So that's all we're doing, all right? You could do the same thing yourself, with pencil and paper and manual guide pulses if that's what you were inclined to do. Now here's an example of a not so good mount. And unfortunately, I can't show you this with the same graph because I had to go back and find historical examples from the few thousand logs that we've got hanging around. But here it's the same idea. The red lines were the north moves and the green points were the south moves. Well, this thing basically never really got going. I mean, it isn't purely a flat spot. The rate of south movement never approached the rate of north movement. So this is a case where we're going to say the test failed. And the reason is, how could you possibly choose a backlash compensation amount that was going to correct for this kind of a problem? Now, looking at this, the likelihood is that this is all some kind of static resistance. It could have been that the scope was horribly imbalanced. It could be that there's something really stiff or fouled up. This doesn't really look like pure deck backlash to me. But this would be an example. This is a real world example of a case where we say the test failed. Here's one that's even harder to figure. You notice that in the north moves, space, there's kind of this jiggering, stair step function. And then you get up here to the top and you have a flat spot, that looks like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe that's for 2 seconds. It's not doing anything at all. But then you get this straggling, south behavior over here. And, this frankly is just a mess. You can't do deck backlash compensation if this is how the mount is going to respond. This is a mechanical problem. I think in this case, what it turned out to be is that the whole gear system was tightened up so much that it was kind of a minor miracle that the thing would move at all. So these are the kinds of things that you have to deal with mechanically. There's nothing that can be done in the software that's going to just make this go away. So let's come back to the question of why can these measurements start out too high? And the basic reason is that the place that you did the measurement could be different than the place where you started guiding, in which case all you've proven is that the backlash depends on where you're pointing. And that's why this thing has to be adaptive. So when we do the backlash compensation, we always are looking to see the results of whatever guide pulse we've issued. And we're very aggressive about reducing it, because if we don't reduce it very quickly, then you get into this oscillation mode, and nobody wants to sit there and watch this thing just oscillate for 2 or 3 minutes. So we're aggressive about decreasing it. And generally speaking, what you'll see is that it stabilizes fairly quickly. Usually within maybe 5 or 6 camera cycles. It will still maybe be irritating to you, but it will stabilize and then you're back in business. We generally don't want to use compensation pulses that are more than about 3 seconds, all right? And the reason for that is that that's good. If it's taking you 3 seconds just to clear the backlash in deck, that's allowing the RA axis to basically run unguided for long periods of time, 3 seconds plus whatever the exposure time is. And most mounts that have this much deck backlash are also going to have somewhat inaccurate tracking, and they're going to suffer if the RA is not guided more aggressively than that. So that's why the backlash test won't recommend backlash compensation values that are greater than about 3 seconds. If you're stuck in that circumstance, obviously the best answer is to get a mechanical improvement and improve the gear mesh or eliminate the stiction if you can on the axis. One quick fix is to use faster guide speeds. So generally speaking, we recommend that people run the mount guide speed up close to 1x sidereal. Some mounts, I guess, don't handle that very well, but I think most of them do. And that reduces this reversal delay by linearly, okay? So if you measure a reversal delay and you're using 0.5x sidereal guide speed, then if you double the guide speed, you have the reversal delay, all right? It also can help clear some kinds of static resistance, and it's generally a good thing to try if you're really hesitant to open up the drive system and try to fiddle around with the mechanics. And if all else fails, you can do unidirectional guiding in deck, meaning you guide only north or only south, in which case you don't get into these reversal situations, and therefore the deck backlash basically doesn't matter anymore. And, you know, people are reluctant to do this. They feel like it's just giving up or something. But really, a lot of experienced imagers choose to run this way anyway, simply so they don't even have to think about backlash issues. And I imaged this way for years and years, and you can get very good imaging results this way. I really don't think people should be quite so hesitant to give it a try if they're dealing with a mount that has these kinds of problems. So I think that's probably the end of it. And hopefully I answered those questions, and hopefully I haven't run over my time allotment. And I guess if there's any other questions or you want to re-ask them, now would be a good time.
What questions? I think you might have answered. Let me just read through them. Can INMO be used to keep RA and deck error about the same, making rounder stars?
Yes, this is an interesting question, and I'm somewhat embarrassed to say it, but I had a circumstance where I could make the deck guiding on my mount arbitrarily good, but I couldn't achieve the same improvements in RA. And so what I would do is intentionally degrade the deck guiding a little bit until those RA and deck numbers came back into line. And it worked fine, right? Obviously, it's not a perfect outcome, but it was a lot better than dealing with elongated stars all the time. So yes, you can tinker around with the deck min move. You can make it be intentionally a little bit too small if you're trying to bring it more in line with RA and not have elongated stars. So that's a good question.
Well, there was another follow-up to that to piggyback on the same question.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can get this right. A general recommendation of figures, PA, backlash, min-mil, or max RA, deck, etc. would be nice. Particularly, point do we need to start to tweak these values?
Okay, there's no reason to ever tweak the max RA and the max deck because those are huge numbers. Those are 2.5 second guide pulses, and you have to understand the max deck value, or the max deck and max RA values, have no effect at all on normal guiding. They're only there to kind of be a safety net for some kind of a tracking disaster where the mount has just, gone off into the weeds for some reason, and you don't want to try to guide that out. But there's really no reason to fiddle with those things. As I said, the things that you want to adjust in the guiding parameters are the min move values, because the seeing can change, from hour to hour, and those are good things to adjust. And if you're using the right ascension predictive PEC algorithm, it's good to fine tune some of those parameters once you've analyzed the frequency spectrum of the RA system, and you know that you want to lock on a particular frequency for PEC. But the other guiding parameters, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be just fine right out of the box.
So Paul actually asked, he says that his graph only shows 5 points north and south. How does he get more sample points? There's been a couple of comments in the chat, but what's your answer to that?
The answer to that is this is the one case where you may need to choose a guide star yourself, and what you want to do is choose a single guide star that's going to give you plenty of room for moving the mount north and not having it run off the sensor. And you just have to figure out which way north is when you're looking at it. You're probably going to have to choose a star that's up well off center and away from any of the margins of the sensor.
I'm looking through it. Alex, did I miss any questions here?
Yeah, we've got some that I haven't seen have been covered. Let me flip back there. The Ernie, I think it was. In your experience, what is a large declination backlash error?
I would say anything over 2 seconds, I would consider to be large.
Yeah, earlier you would refer to 625 milliseconds as pretty good for the kinds of mounts we have.
Yeah, that's maybe I was being too critical there. 600, 700, 800 milliseconds is going to be fine because that's not really delaying the guide cadence much, and it's going to be well handled by the backlash compensation feature. So basically, anything from a second or lower, I would say is fine. We'll be able to handle it nicely. 1 second to 2 seconds, you're kind of in a middle ground there where maybe you want to try to achieve some improvements. Anything over 2 seconds, I would say it would be worth trying to figure out why the mount is doing that and see if you can get it fixed. Sometimes it's really simple. Sometimes it's a matter of just changing the mesh on the deck gear system to reduce it.
Okay. Steve Segirian asked a question that I was dealing with on a project that I've got to build a real portable mount. But are some cameras just guide cameras? Are some of them just not very good for guiding?
Well, I mean, what would it mean to be not very good?
What makes a good guide camera, Bruce?
Well,
how about we rephrase the question to
okay.
What should I look for in a guide camera?
Well, some of the things are kind of hardware oriented and probably fairly obvious. You want to have a high degree of sensitivity on the sensor. You want it to be a monochrome guide camera. You would like to presumably have as large a sensor as you can so that you've got a sizable field of view. That's more important if you're going to be using it on an off-axis guider. So those are kind of the basics. I think the part that people don't think about, don't pay any attention to, is the quality of the software. So an excellent guide camera for me is one that I don't have to fiddle around with. I don't have to keep reinstalling drivers or working around buggy drivers or finding out that, the camera that I have, that model is no longer supported. Those are the kinds of things that will bite you. And they're not really hardware specification things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you want something that works reliably.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Anak Chan wants to ask a question about that. Well, what he says is, I think a general recommendation of figures, polar alignment, backlash, minimum motions, aggression, max RA deck, etc., would be nice. Particularly at what point do we need to start to tweak? And I'm not sure, Anak, but I think you're asking, can we just go with the defaults? And how do we know when the defaults aren't working for us?
Okay, well, the answer is yes. You should go with the defaults. The defaults are tuned to the image scale that you're using. That's why there's different PHD2 configurations for different setups. So when you run that new profile wizard, by the time it's done, it has already it's already made the best recommendations that we know how to for all those guiding parameters. Then the issue is, if you think that your guiding is still not up to snuff, the worst thing you can do is start turning knobs and fiddling around with guiding parameters, because you're probably just going to make it worse and you're not going to learn anything in the process. So what you should do, unfortunately, is collect those logs and learn how to analyze them. And we can help you do that on the forum. I mean, we look at, 500 or 600 or 700 logs a year, and you could be one of them. And I will say that I can't even remember the last time that I analyzed somebody's guiding and ended up telling them that they needed to change the hysteresis value or aggressiveness. What I usually do is tell them, put it back where it was, because the problem that you're having has nothing to do with guiding. The problem is in the mount. And so you have to understand what the shortcomings are with the mount first in order to know what to do with the guiding to be able to mitigate those problems.
Okay. Is there a single button that will restore all the defaults for any given configuration?
There are two single buttons. If you go into the advanced settings, into the algorithms tab, maybe a place you haven't been before, you will find there's a column there for RA and a column for deck, and each has reset buttons.
Okay.
So if you reset it, then it restores all those guiding parameters.
So for those people like me that have been messing around with it for a while and kind of lost track of where I should be, I should just go back and reset everything and start over again.
That would be my recommendation. Yeah.
Okay. Eric, I think I've gone through the questions. Folks, are there any other questions you see out there?
Well, there's a question that just came up. I'm not sure what the question is, but I'll read it. Can you recommend anything for us ASI Air people?
No. I can't.
You made a decision to go with ASI Air, and that means you're going to go with ASI Air.
Yep.
And it's a good decision if you got what you wanted. So go for it.
Bruce, I do want to take a second to say that I want to thank you and others who are working on PhD for, there's an incredible amount of amazing stuff happening under the hood, even more than I realized. And the fact that this software is available for free to us and that there's support on the forums is really incredible. And without guiding, I think the majority of us wouldn't be able to get as good of images as we get. And PhD just makes it push here, dummy.
Yeah.
Easy.
How many people actually work on putting this thing together? What's your development team look like, Bruce?
It's pretty small. Andy and I are really the ones that do almost all the development work.
Sandy Galasso, right?
Yeah. And he's been pulled away from it a little bit more the last year and a half or so, just because of other obligations, but he's not going away. He'll be back. But yeah, he and I do most of the development work. He still handles all the builds. We have a community of guys who do more work on the Unix-based platforms, and we have, a hopefully growing number of people that help out on the support forum to answer questions and try to help people who are really struggling.
Yeah, but it's just that it is the community effort putting out what is, let's face it, largely the standard among amateur imagers. It's just a community of people that got together to do that. It's quite a statement.
Yes, and what we found is that, even though Andy and I are the ones that do most of the development work, people will come forward with a particular implementation or a particular idea, and we'll be enthusiastic about it and get that into the product, and then they move on and do other things. That's what happened with the predictive periodic error correction, which truly is a rocket science project. It was the basis for a PhD thesis by the guy who did the work. It's a brilliant piece of work, and he worked on that for over a year, and then got his PhD and moved on, and we've been ever grateful since he did it.
Bruce, you could stop your presentation if you'd like.
Yeah,
I'm
just
stopping.
and just
Quit screen sharing then.
yeah, quit the screen share, and then we can see you.
Well, seeing me might not be any great treat.
Well,
So here we go. See, I warned you. I warned you.
I think people like to see the people who are behind the software that we use every night.
Okay.
And just to draw a fine point to that, when you were saying that, what was it? A micron is like 40 or 50 human hairs, and I'm thinking, what's that? What's a human hair?
Well, you
Anyway.
might be able to you can get in touch with somebody and get one, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway,
Look at this, right? Who's talking?
and I did tell you that this is a rather informal group we have here on the
Yes.
YouTube. So okay, where are we, Eric? We good on the questions?
No, I think we're good to go. It's
Okay. We'd love to have you back on some other things you've got to explain to us about PhD. Although it's for dummies, we should just be able to press here and make it work. But,
Well, we try. We try.
It is amazing what it can do. I mean, it really is amazing. But we're gonna call it and invite you back someday when you get something else, some other chunk of it that you want to explain to us. I could use some help getting what the advanced things say, why I opt for this, why I opt for that. There's 1,000 things we could do.
Yeah, one of them would probably be multi-star guiding, because that's the latest big feature that we've implemented.
Yes.
And I think people are probably curious about how that works.
We did get one last minute question about using, can you use PemPro with PHD2?
Yes, but PemPro basically just creates the periodic error curve and uploads it to the mount. So you don't use PemPro while you're guiding. But for most mounts, unfortunately not all of them, but for most mounts, if you get a good PE correction curve programmed into the mount, that benefits guiding. It just makes guiding easier.
That's good to know, because there's just kind of a divide in the community on whether periodic error correction fights guiding or whether they work together.
Yes, and unfortunately, that depends on how the PE was implemented by the mount vendor. Okay, some of them do a really good job, and it always helps. Others of them have done a really poor job, and then that can sometimes lead to really bad results.
Interesting.
Bruce, it would probably be a good idea if you posted a link to this program, because I am sure that there are a lot of people out there using your guiding assistant that could use the information that you just presented to people.
Okay, yeah, we can do that.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah.
Okay. We could go on for a while because we're just really appreciative of all the work you do.
Yeah.
Okay,
But-
no problem. Happy to do it.
Okay, but we like to keep the shows in. When are we down to 61? Yeah, we're starting to lose them. Don't go away yet. We haven't left. Anyway,
Time to go to
Good night,
time to go to
everybody.
bed.
time to go to bed. Okay.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody, and we'll see you next week when we're
All
going
right, thanks,
down.
guys.
We're going to go down under next week and see some wide field astroimaging with
All right.
with the groom. Okay. Okay.
See ya.
Bye bye.
Good night,
Take
all.
us out, Molly. You're in
night.
charge.
All righty.